The morning sun cast long shadows across the small regional airport in rural Montana, as 12-year-old Jake Sullivan watched his father complete the pre-flight inspection of their Cessna 172. The boy had been flying with his dad since he was 7 years old, absorbing every detail of aircraft operation like a sponge. His father, Captain Mike Sullivan, was a commercial airline pilot who owned this small plane for weekend adventures and training flights with his son. Today's flight was supposed to be routine, a short hop from Billings to visit Jake's grandmother in Miles City. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and minimal wind. Jake settled into the co-pilot seat, adjusting his headset and running through the familiar checklist alongside his father. He had memorized every switch, gauge, and control in the cockpit. Through countless hours of observation and instruction, Captain Sullivan had always been impressed by his son's natural aptitude for aviation. Jake could read instruments better than some adult students, understood radio communications, and had even taken the controls during several supervised flights. However, nothing could have prepared either of them for what was about to unfold at 8,500 feet above the Montana landscape. 20 minutes into their flight, Captain Sullivan began feeling dizzy and disoriented. He initially attributed it to the early morning departure and lack of coffee, but the sensation quickly intensified. His vision started blurring, and he felt an overwhelming wave of nausea wash over him. The experienced pilot recognized these weren't normal symptoms and immediately began considering emergency landing options. Within moments, Captain Sullivan's condition deteriorated rapidly. His hands became unsteady on the controls, and he struggled to maintain focus on the instrument panel. The veteran pilot, who had flown through countless challenging situations during his 20-year career, found himself fighting to stay conscious, while responsible for his son's safety, thousands of feet above ground. Jake noticed his father's distress immediately. The color had drained from Captain Sullivan's face, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead despite the cool cabin temperature. When his father's head suddenly slumped forward and his grip loosened on the yoke, Jake realized they were facing a life-threatening emergency. The aircraft began a slight descent as his unconscious father's weight shifted against the controls. Terror gripped the young boy for a moment, but his extensive exposure to aviation procedures kicked in. Jake had witnessed his father handle various emergency scenarios during simulator training sessions, and those observations now became crucial knowledge. He knew that panicking would only make their situation worse, so he forced himself to remain calm and think clearly about their options. The radio crackled with routine air traffic control communications from other aircraft, reminding Jake that help was available if he could figure out how to use it. He looked at his unconscious father, then at the complex array of instruments and controls that now represented their only hope for survival. The boy realized that everything his father had taught him about flying was about to be put to the ultimate test. Jake's heart pounded as he reached across the cockpit to steady the aircraft's controls. The Cessna had entered a gentle descent, and he knew from his father's teachings that maintaining level flight was his first priority. His small hands gripped the yoke, and he carefully applied back pressure to arrest the descent, just as he had practiced during their training flights together. The 12-year-old fought against his natural instinct to freeze with fear. Instead, he drew upon months of watching his father's methodical approach to flying. Jake began talking himself through the situation, using the same calm tone his father always employed during their lessons. He checked the altitude. They were now at 8,200 feet and descending slowly. The airspeed indicator showed they were flying at a safe speed, which gave him some reassurance. First, Jake needed to try waking his father. He reached over and shook Captain Sullivan's shoulder while keeping one hand on the controls. His father remained completely unresponsive, breathing but clearly unconscious. Jake realized he was truly on his own and would need to land the aircraft himself. The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming for someone who had never completed a landing without his father's guidance. Jake's next priority was establishing radio contact with air traffic control. He had memorized the emergency frequency from listening to his father's flight instruction stories. With trembling fingers, he adjusted the radio to 121.5 MHz, the universal emergency frequency that all air traffic control facilities monitor continuously. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Jake spoke into his headset microphone, his voice shaking but clear. This is Cessna November 742 Delta Bravo. I'm 12 years old and my dad is unconscious. I need help landing the airplane. The words felt surreal coming from his mouth, but he knew that clear communication was essential for getting the assistance he desperately needed. The response came immediately from Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center. The controller's voice was professional but carried an unmistakable note of urgency. Cessna 2 Delta Bravo, this is Denver Center. We copy your emergency. Can you maintain level flight? Jake confirmed that he could control the aircraft and provided his approximate position based on the GPS display. Within minutes, the emergency response system swung into action. The air traffic controller began coordinating with approach control facilities, emergency services, and even contacted Captain Sullivan's airline to locate qualified pilots who could provide guidance. Jake found himself at the center of one of the most unusual aviation emergencies in recent history. The controller asked Jake about his flying experience, and the boy honestly explained his background. He had logged over 50 hours of flight time as an observer and had manipulated the controls during numerous training flights, but had never completed a full landing sequence independently. This information helped the controllers understand both his capabilities and limitations as they developed their assistance strategy. As Jake maintained level flight and followed the controller's initial vectors, he couldn't help but think about his grandmother waiting for them in Miles City. She would be worried when they failed to arrive on schedule. But right now his only focus had to be getting both himself and his father safely back on the ground. Denver Center immediately began coordinating the most comprehensive emergency response in the region's aviation history. Within 15 minutes of Jake's initial Mayday call, they had contacted retired Air Force Colonel and flight instructor Patricia Williams, who happened to be monitoring radio frequencies from her home near Denver. Colonel Williams had over 30 years of flying experience and had trained countless pilots, including several emergency landings with inexperienced aviators. Colonel Williams quickly drove to the nearest air traffic control facility, where she could communicate directly with Jake through the radio system. Her calm, grandmotherly voice became Jake's lifeline as she began walking him through the essential procedures for safely landing the aircraft. She started by having Jake describe everything he could see on the instrument panel, helping her assess their current situation accurately. "Jake, you're doing an excellent job so far," Colonel Williams said reassuringly. "I need you to look at the fuel gauges and tell me how much fuel you have remaining." Jake checked both fuel tanks and reported that they showed approximately 2 hours of flying time remaining. This gave them a comfortable margin to find the best airport for landing and practice the approach if necessary. The colonel began teaching Jake about the landing pattern, explaining each step in simple terms that a 12-year-old could understand. She emphasized that landing an airplane was like riding a bicycle down a gentle hill. It required smooth, gradual movements rather than sudden changes. Jake absorbed every word, knowing that his life and his father's life depended on following her instructions precisely. Meanwhile, emergency crews at 3 different airports were being alerted and positioned for possible landing attempts. The primary target was Billings Logan International Airport, where Jake's father had originally planned to depart. The airport's longer runways and comprehensive emergency services made it the safest option for an inexperienced pilot attempting his first solo landing. Airport Emergency Coordinator Sarah Chen began orchestrating the response at Billings Logan. Fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency medical personnel were positioned along the runway. The airport even cleared all other air traffic, giving Jake exclusive access to the airspace and eliminating any possibility of confusion or additional stress during his approach. Colonel Williams spent nearly an hour teaching Jake the fundamentals of aircraft approach and landing procedures. She explained how to reduce power gradually, how to lower the flaps to increase lift at slower speeds, and most importantly, how to maintain proper airspeed throughout the descent. Jake practiced these procedures at higher altitudes, making small adjustments under her guidance while maintaining safe flying conditions. The most challenging aspect was teaching Jake about the landing flare, the final moment when pilots reduce power and gently raise the nose to touch down smoothly on the runway. Colonel Williams used simple analogies, comparing it to catching a thrown ball with soft hands rather than rigid arms. She emphasized that Jake should focus on looking down the runway, rather than directly at the ground in front of him. As they practiced these maneuvers, Captain Sullivan remained unconscious but stable in the pilot's seat. Jake checked on his father regularly, noting that his breathing appeared normal and his color was slowly returning. The boy couldn't help wondering what had caused his father's sudden illness, but Colonel Williams kept redirecting his attention to the flying tasks at hand. After nearly 2 hours of airborne instruction, Colonel Williams and the air traffic controllers determined that Jake was ready to attempt his landing at Billings Logan International Airport. The airport had been completely cleared of other traffic, and emergency vehicles lined the runway in preparation for any possible outcome. Jake could see the airport in the distance, its runways appearing impossibly small from his current altitude of 6,000 feet. "Jake, I want you to begin reducing your altitude very gradually," Colonel Williams instructed through the radio.
"Pull the power back just slightly and let the nose come down a little bit."
"We're going to descend at about 500 feet per minute." Jake followed her instructions carefully, watching the altimeter as the needle slowly moved counterclockwise. The aircraft responded exactly as Colonel Williams had predicted during their practice sessions. The approach controller at Billings Logan took over radio communication, guiding Jake onto the proper approach path for runway 28 left. The controller's voice was steady and encouraging, treating Jake like any other pilot while providing the additional guidance he needed. "Cessna 2 Delta Bravo, turn left heading 280 degrees. You're looking good for a straight-in approach." Jake could feel his hands sweating inside his gloves as the runway grew larger in the windscreen. Every lesson his father had taught him during their flights together seemed to rush back into his memory. He remembered his father saying that landing was just flying the airplane all the way to the ground, and that smooth control inputs were always better than quick corrections. At 3,000 feet above ground level, Jake began configuring the aircraft for landing according to Colonel Williams's instructions. He extended the first notch of flaps, feeling the aircraft slow slightly and require a bit more back pressure on the controls to maintain altitude. The Cessna became more stable and forgiving at the slower speed, giving Jake increased confidence in his ability to control the aircraft. "You're doing fantastic, Jake," came Colonel Williams's voice. "Now I want you to lower the landing gear. There should be a gear handle or switch near your left knee." Jake located the landing gear lever and moved it to the down position. He felt a slight vibration as the gear extended and locked into place, and 3 green lights appeared on the instrument panel confirming that all landing gear was properly extended. The runway was now clearly visible ahead, looking like a gray ribbon stretching across the Montana landscape. Jake could see the emergency vehicles positioned along its length, their red and yellow lights flashing in preparation for his arrival. The sight was both reassuring and intimidating, reminding him of the serious nature of their situation. At 1,500 feet above the ground, Jake extended the flaps to their full landing position and reduced power further, just as Colonel Williams had taught him. The aircraft slowed to its final approach speed, and Jake worked to maintain the proper descent path toward the runway threshold. His father remained unconscious beside him, but Jake noticed that Captain Sullivan's breathing seemed stronger and more regular than before. "Cessna 2 Delta Bravo, you're cleared to land runway 28 left," announced the tower controller. "Emergency vehicles are standing by. You're looking great on the approach." Jake acknowledged the clearance, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his 12-year-old body. The runway numbers grew larger in the windscreen as he guided the aircraft toward what he hoped would be a successful landing. Jake's hands gripped the yoke tighter as the Cessna descended through 500 feet above the runway. The ground rushed up toward them faster than he had anticipated, and for a moment panic threatened to overwhelm him. Colonel Williams's voice came through his headset at exactly the right moment, calm and reassuring. "Remember, Jake, keep your eyes focused on the far end of the runway, not right in front of you. Let the airplane settle gently." The runway threshold passed beneath them, and Jake began the most critical phase of the landing, the flare. He gradually reduced power and gently pulled back on the yoke, trying to replicate the smooth motion he had watched his father perform dozens of times. The aircraft's descent rate decreased, and Jake felt the satisfying sensation of the Cessna floating just above the runway surface. "Perfect, Jake. Hold it there, let it settle," encouraged Colonel Williams. The main landing gear touched the runway with a surprisingly gentle bump, followed immediately by the nose wheel. Jake had successfully landed the aircraft, but his job wasn't finished yet. He needed to maintain control during the rollout and bring the Cessna to a safe stop. The aircraft bounced slightly after touchdown, which startled Jake, but he remembered his father explaining that small bounces were normal during landing. Instead of trying to force the airplane back down, Jake let it settle naturally while maintaining directional control with the rudder pedals. The Cessna tracked straight down the center line of the runway as it slowed from landing speed. Jake applied gentle brake pressure, feeling the aircraft decelerate steadily as they rolled down the 8,000-foot runway. Emergency vehicles began following them at a safe distance, ready to respond if needed. The tower controller's voice crackled through the radio. "Outstanding job, Cessna 2 Delta Bravo. Continue your rollout and taxi clear of the runway when able." As the aircraft slowed to taxi speed, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. They had made it safely to the ground, and his father was still breathing steadily beside him. Jake guided the Cessna onto the taxiway, following the ground controller's instructions to taxi toward the terminal, where ambulances and emergency personnel were waiting. The moment Jake shut down the engine, paramedics rushed to the aircraft. They carefully removed Captain Sullivan from the pilot's seat and began assessing his condition on a stretcher beside the airplane. Jake climbed out of the cockpit on shaky legs, suddenly feeling the full weight of what he had just accomplished. Several airport officials and emergency responders gathered around him, offering congratulations and support. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, one of the responding paramedics, quickly determined that Captain Sullivan was suffering from severe food poisoning, likely from breakfast at a roadside diner before their flight. His vital signs were stable, and he was already beginning to show signs of regaining consciousness as they loaded him into the ambulance. The doctor assured Jake that his father would make a full recovery with proper medical treatment. Colonel Williams arrived at the airport within an hour of Jake's landing, having driven from Denver to meet the young hero in person. The experienced flight instructor embraced Jake warmly, telling him that his performance had been exceptional for any pilot, let alone a 12-year-old facing his first emergency situation. She presented him with a small pair of pilot's wings, saying he had earned them through his courage and skill. Airport manager Robert Thompson shook Jake's hand and told him that his landing would become part of aviation history. The boy's calm demeanor under pressure and his ability to absorb and apply complex flight instruction had saved 2 lives and prevented what could have been a tragic accident. Thompson arranged for Jake to stay in the airport's VIP lounge while his father received medical treatment. Captain Sullivan regained consciousness in the hospital emergency room 3 hours after landing, with Jake sitting anxiously beside his bed. The first words out of his father's mouth were asking if Jake was okay, followed immediately by questions about how they had gotten safely on the ground. When Jake explained what had happened during the flight, Captain Sullivan's eyes filled with tears of pride and amazement at his son's incredible accomplishment. Dr. Rodriguez confirmed that Captain Sullivan had indeed suffered severe food poisoning from contaminated eggs at the roadside diner where they had eaten breakfast. The toxins had caused rapid onset symptoms including dizziness, nausea, and eventual loss of consciousness. With proper treatment and IV fluids, he was expected to make a complete recovery within 24 hours, though he would be grounded from flying for at least a week pending medical clearance. News of Jake's heroic landing spread rapidly through aviation circles and then to national media outlets. Within hours, reporters from major television networks were requesting interviews with the 12-year-old pilot who had saved his father's life. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an immediate investigation, not to assign blame, but to document the incident for future emergency response training programs. Jake's story captured the imagination of people worldwide. Video footage of his landing, recorded by airport security cameras, was viewed millions of times online. Aviation experts praised his calm demeanor and precise execution of complex procedures under extreme pressure. Many noted that Jake's performance exceeded that of some experienced pilots they had observed in similar emergency situations. The boys' elementary school principal, Mrs. Patricia Martinez, organized a special assembly to honor Jake's achievement. His classmates, who had previously known him as a quiet kid who loved airplanes, now saw him as a genuine hero. Jake remained modest about his actions, consistently crediting his father's excellent instruction and Colonel Williams's expert guidance for their successful outcome. Several aviation organizations reached out to offer Jake scholarships for future flight training. The Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association presented him with their highest Youth Achievement Award, while the Experimental Aircraft Association invited him to speak at their annual convention. Jake's father was overwhelmed by the generous offers, but insisted that his son's education would remain the top priority. Colonel Williams became something of a celebrity herself, with flight training organizations requesting her expertise for developing emergency procedures involving inexperienced pilots. She credited Jake's success to his father's excellent instruction and the boy's natural aptitude for aviation, but noted that his emotional maturity under pressure was exceptional for someone his age. The incident led to new training protocols for air traffic controllers dealing with pilot incapacitation emergencies. Jake's case demonstrated the importance of having experienced flight instructors available to provide real-time guidance during crisis situations. Several airports began developing rapid response programs to connect emergency aircraft with qualified instructor pilots via radio communication. Captain Sullivan's airline granted him extended family leave to recover from his medical incident and spend time processing the traumatic experience with his son. The company also commended Jake's actions and invited him to visit their training facilities to meet other pilots who had heard about his remarkable achievement. The airline's chief pilot noted that Jake's performance demonstrated principles that some professional pilots struggled to master. 3 weeks after the incident, father and son returned to their local airport to inspect their Cessna, which had been thoroughly examined by FAA investigators. The aircraft showed no signs of damage from Jake's landing, confirming that his technique had been nearly perfect despite the challenging circumstances. Seeing the airplane again brought back intense emotions for both of them, but also a sense of closure and accomplishment. 6 months after his emergency landing, Jake stood beside the same Cessna 172, but this time the circumstances were completely different. Captain Sullivan watched proudly as his 13-year-old son completed his first official flying lesson with a certified flight instructor. Jake's experience during the emergency had accelerated his aviation education, and he was now formally beginning his journey toward earning a private pilot's license. The emergency landing had fundamentally changed Jake's perspective on flying and life in general. He approached aviation with increased respect for its complexities, while maintaining his natural enthusiasm for flight. His instructor, Mark Stevens, noted that Jake possessed an unusual combination of technical skill and emotional maturity that made him an exceptional student pilot. The boy's ability to remain calm under pressure had been proven in the most dramatic way possible. Jake's relationship with his father had also deepened through their shared traumatic experience. Captain Sullivan realized how much aviation knowledge he had unconsciously transmitted to his son during their casual flights together. He began taking a more structured approach to Jake's flight education, ensuring that every lesson included both technical skills and safety procedures that could prove crucial in emergency situations. The family's story continued inspiring others throughout the aviation community. Jake received hundreds of letters from young people expressing interest in learning to fly, and from parents thanking him for demonstrating the importance of quality flight instruction. Several flight schools reported increased enrollment in their youth programs, crediting Jake's example with sparking renewed interest in aviation careers among young people. Colonel Williams remained in regular contact with the Sullivan family, serving as an unofficial mentor for Jake's continued aviation education. She often said that helping Jake land safely had been one of the most rewarding experiences of her entire flying career. The colonel incorporated their story into her emergency training programs, using it to demonstrate how proper instruction and clear communication could overcome seemingly impossible situations. Captain Sullivan eventually returned to his airline duties with a new appreciation for the fragility of life and the importance of emergency preparedness. He began volunteering as an instructor for young pilot programs, sharing his expertise with the next generation of aviators. His airline featured Jake's story in their safety training materials, using it to emphasize the value of thorough emergency procedures training. Jake's academic performance improved significantly after his experience, as teachers noted increased focus and maturity in all his subjects. He began considering aerospace engineering as a potential college major, inspired by his desire to contribute to aviation safety improvements. His science teacher reported that Jake approached problem-solving with a systematic methodology that impressed his peers and educators alike. The FAA's final investigation report praised all parties involved in the emergency response, from Jake's calm handling of the aircraft to Colonel Williams' expert guidance and the air traffic controller's professional coordination. The incident became a case study for aviation emergency response training, demonstrating how proper procedures and clear communication could turn a potential tragedy into a success story. 2 years later, on his 15th birthday, Jake received his student pilot certificate and began flying solo under instructor supervision. His first solo flight took place on a calm morning with perfect weather conditions, but Captain Sullivan couldn't help remembering the dramatic circumstances of his son's first real solo flight. As Jake taxied out for takeoff, his father reflected on how their emergency experience had transformed a frightening situation into the foundation for his son's promising aviation career. The small airport where they had originally planned to visit Jake's grandmother eventually named their youth flight training program in his honor. Jake continued visiting regularly, sharing his story with new student pilots and emphasizing the importance of thorough preparation and remaining calm during unexpected challenges. His message resonated with young aviators who saw him as proof that age was no barrier to achieving remarkable things when proper training met courage and determination.